Section 2B of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the freedom of thought, belief, and expression. However, this right is not unlimited, and as we've discussed previously, Section 1 of the Charter allows for reasonable limitations on the rights provided in other sections of the Charter. One of those limits on the right to freedom of expression and thought comes from the so-called hate propaganda provisions of the Criminal Code of Canada. This week on Don't Talk TV, I'm going to look at those sections of the Criminal Code in light of some recent events in the news. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. Now, the question of hate crimes and hate propaganda has come up in the news recently. Two items in particular caught my attention. One, a gentleman named Travis Patron, or Patron, not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, who's apparently the leader of the Nationalist Party of Canada, was arrested and charged with promotion of genocide under Section 318 of the Criminal Code and willful promotion of hatred under Section 319 of the Criminal Code. This was in relation to a YouTube video that he had posted some years ago, and which the Canadian Anti-Hate Network had brought to the attention of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The second item is from February the 22nd, where an article asked why a pub in downtown London called the Ale House hadn't been charged with willfully promoting hatred for a sign that they posted on their building that said, "We love Chinese people, but we hate the genocide and the Chinese virus that your communist government has inflicted on us." Now, it's important for Canadians to understand the hate propaganda laws, firstly, so that you understand both your rights and your obligations for public discourse in Canadian society, and also to give some insight into why these charges are so rarely laid. So in this episode, firstly, I'll cover what is laid out in sections 318 and 319 of the Criminal Code and to explain what is required to prove charges under those sections. Then I'll look specifically at how those sections of the Criminal Code might apply against the video in question posted by Mr. Patron or Patron. And finally, I'll look at how those sections may or may not apply to the Ale House in London, Ontario. So the hate propaganda laws are separated into two sections. The first, and more serious, but also less often prosecuted, is Section 318 of the Criminal Code, which is advocating genocide. So that section reads that everyone who advocates or promotes genocide is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years. Now, genocide is specifically defined under subsection 2 as an act committed with the intent of destroying in whole or in part any identifiable group, specifically killing members of that group, or deliberately inflicting upon that group life conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of that group. So for the Crown Attorney to prove that someone's advocating or promoting genocide, they have to prove that the person is actually calling for the killing of individuals or the purposeful imposition of conditions that are so bad that they would most likely die, or a large number of them would be certain to die. Now, an identifiable group is also specifically defined in this section. So, an identifiable group is defined in this section as any section of the public distinguished by color, race, religion, national or ethnic origin, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or mental or physical disability. Section 319 is then public incitement of hatred, and there's two ways that individuals can be charged under that section. The first is under subsection 1 that says that everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, incites hatred against any identifiable group where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace is guilty. And the maximum is 2 years on that charge. And the second is under subsection 2 that says everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group is guilty. Now, identifiable group has the same definition for both sections 318 and section 319. Now, section 319 The Crown does not have to prove that the individual willfully incited hatred, but they do have to prove that what they said was something that would be likely to cause a breach of the peace. Subsection 2 does not require any proof that the peace might be breached, but it has a more onerous requirement that it be proved that the person willfully promoted hatred by the comments that they made. The case law in all of these sections says that the incitement must be both public and direct. The case also says that promoting hatred requires more than encouraging ill will. It must be direct and active stimulation of hatred, and the accused must be proved to promote an emotional state of an extreme and intense nature. In a Supreme Court decision titled Her Majesty the Queen and Andrews, Justice Corey stated, quote, "Hatred is not a word of casual connotation. To promote hatred is to instill detestation, enmity, ill will, and malevolence in another. Clearly, an expression must go a long way before it qualifies within the definition of Section 319 sub 2. So I think this shows right at the beginning that it's very difficult to prove these sections because of the intensity of the hatred that has to be engendered by the words that are spoken or propagated by an individual. So the Crown has to prove that the individual either directly intended to promote hatred or that the words they uttered it was just so obvious that that would occur, that it was certain or substantially certain that hatred would result, that intention is imputed to them. So there's certainly very little room for gray area, and it would seem that comments made by individuals have to be very obvious in their intent in order for the Crown to prove the case. So let's take a look at these cases that have come up in the media recently, dealing first with Mr. Patron, who was charged on February the 17th. The video in question is entitled, quote, "Beware the Parasitic Tribe," unquote. According to the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, parasitic tribe is a specific reference to Jewish people. I'm not certain that that's something in common knowledge that courts could take judicial notice of. Judicial notice is when something is so widely known that courts can accept it without there being evidence to establish that point. So, for example, someone to say the sky is blue, the court can take judicial notice of the fact that the sky is blue because this is so widely known, and you don't need a scientist to come to explain that that is in fact the case. I'm not so certain that everyone knows that parasitic tribe refers to Jewish people. I suspect they might have to call experts to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt that that is in fact the case. In the video in question, Mr. Patron or Patron, he never actually mentions Jewish people. Now, he does make a number of accusations against these individuals.
Everywhere these people go, they infiltrate the media, they hijack the central bank, and they infect the body politic like a parasite. And they profit from our wars. And they seek to control and demoralize us in every aspect of what we try to do. It's their world. And if they had their way, our entire way of life would be eradicated. They don't like us. In fact, they despise us.
Now, a number of these accusations seem fairly vague to me. I think that the argument would be that they promote hatred because he's accusing these people of doing things that most people would not be happy with and that they don't like, and he's saying that they're trying to destroy our way of life, for example. So the inference is that you're going to hate someone who's trying to destroy your way of life. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network, in their complaint filed with the RCMP, suggested that the things said by Mr. Patron in his video have been definitively defined as equaling hate by the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of Her Majesty the Queen and Keegstra. I'm not certain that they're right in their interpretation of Keegstra. That case specifically dealt with the constitutionality of sections 318 and 319 of the Criminal Code, and didn't deal directly with whether the things that Mr. Keegstra said constituted proof of advocating genocide or promoting hatred. Now, I think it is worth noting that Mr. Keegstra was accused of specifically accusing the Jewish people, and he apparently was a school teacher who actually taught his students that Jewish people were, quote, sadistic, child killers, and inherently evil. I suspect that Mr. Patron or Patron's defense lawyer, or perhaps himself if he decides to represent himself, would argue that Mr. Keegstra was much more direct in his incitement and much harsher in the things he was saying. For example, saying that people kill children is going to enrage people more, I suspect, than saying that they want to destroy Canadian way of life. Do Mr. Patron's accusations rise to the level of promoting an emotional state of extreme and intense nature? I think that's something for a court to decide. It seems to me that this video may be a bit in the gray area. I think there's certainly arguments to be made for both sides. Now, Mr. Patron was also charged with advocating genocide under Section 319 of the Criminal Code. This charge, I think, it's much clearer that the Crown will have an extremely difficult time in proving. Based on the Canadian Anti-Hate Network complaint, I take it that where they say he's advocating genocide is when he says near the end of the video,
and what we need to do, perhaps more than anything, is remove these people once and for all from our country.
Based on the definition that we covered of advocacy of genocide, I don't think that meets it. He's calling for people to be removed from Canada. Now, I would suggest that removal is clearly not killing them, that's deporting them. And I think it's far from clear that deportation of people on its face would meet the definition of imposing conditions that are calculated to bring about the destruction of people. Turning then to the Ale House in London, Ontario, I have an article here from the London Free Press titled, "Did Downtown Pub's Controversial Sign Cross Criminal Line?" So as we can see the sign in the picture here, it's as I said, we love Chinese people, but we hate, basically they're saying that we hate the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And the case goes on to describe how police erred in not charging a downtown London bar owner for signage some called divisive and even racist, one legal activist says. And Sam Troskow, a Western University law professor, said he believes the signs outside Dundas Street's Ale House, which called COVID-19 the China virus, sparked intense public criticism and may violate Canada's hate speech laws. With all due respect to Professor Troskow, I think he's clearly wrong that sign runs afoul of Canada's hate propaganda laws. Firstly, I think that it fails on being directed towards an identifiable group. As we've outlined, identifiable groups relate to religious groups, ethnicities, nationalities, and nowhere in that definition do you find political parties. So I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party would qualify as an identifiable group under the provisions of Sections 318 or Section 319 of the Criminal Code. So right there, it would not qualify as hate propaganda because it's not directed towards an identifiable group as defined by the Criminal Code of Canada. Secondly, I would suggest that deploring a genocide that the Canadian Parliament itself condemned by a vote of 266-0 on the 22nd of February 2021, condemning a genocide is clearly not engendering hatred. As for calling COVID-19 the China virus, well, the media is frequently referring to various strains of COVID-19 based on where they've first been identified. So you have the UK strain of COVID-19, you have the Brazil strain, the South Africa strain, etc. COVID-19 was originally identified in Wuhan, China. Certainly the argument can be made that using the same naming techniques that the media uses for various strains, calling the original COVID-19 the China virus, is in keeping with those naming practices. Certainly no one would accuse the media of promoting hatred. Therefore, I think it would be very difficult to make out a charge against the owner of the ale house. And that's why he was never charged, because the police looked into this, they determined that the grounds did not exist to lay charges under the criminal code. This video is not legal advice. You should always contact a lawyer for specific advice tailored to your situation. You can call me at my 1-855 number listed below or another lawyer. This week's episode of Don't Talk TV, we've looked at the hate propaganda provisions of the Criminal Code of Canada, and then we've looked at 2 specific instances in the news where this has come up and discussed how those sections may or may not apply. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing.